The old preacher's hands trembled as he held the worn leather Bible, its pages yellowed from years of faithful reading in the dim light of countless oil lamps. Ezra McCullough had seen more heartache in his 67 years than most men could bear. Yet here he stood before a congregation of broken souls in a makeshift church carved from prairie sod, speaking words that had carried him through the darkest valleys of his life. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "I want to tell you about a psalm that changed everything for me, and I pray it'll do the same for you. But first, let me share how I came to understand its power, because sometimes the Lord teaches us through our lowest moments." The wind whistled through the gaps in the sod walls as families huddled together on rough wooden benches. These were people who knew poverty intimately, farmers whose crops had failed 3 years running, widows struggling to feed their children, men who'd lost everything to drought and locusts and the cruel indifference of nature. 20 years ago, I had a spread down in Kansas that was the envy of every man in 3 counties. 200 acres of the finest wheat land you ever saw, cattle grazing on hills so green they looked like God's own emerald carpet. I had a wife, Sarah, who could make a home feel like heaven itself, and 2 boys strong enough to work a full day's labor alongside their pa. Ezra's voice caught slightly. I thought I had it all figured out, thought my hard work and good intentions were enough to secure our future. He paused, scanning the faces before him, weathered countenances that reflected his own journey through loss. But pride, friends, pride goes before a fall, just like the good book warns. I'd forgotten that everything we have comes from the Lord's hand, and what he gives he can surely take away. Sarah Jenkins shifted on her bench, her 3 young children pressed close against her thin frame. Her husband had died in a mining accident 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and the clothes on their backs. She'd walked 12 miles through snow to reach this service, drawn by rumors that Preacher McCullough had words that could break the chains of desperation. "The drought came first," Ezra continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Not just any drought, but the kind that turns green fields to dust and makes strong men weep at the sight of their withered crops. Then came the grasshoppers, clouds of them so thick they blocked out the sun. They ate everything, the remaining grain, the vegetable garden Sarah had tended so carefully, even the bark off the fruit trees." He walked slowly across the front of the small church, his boots creaking on the rough planked floor. But that wasn't the end of it. When a man's down, seems like the world takes pleasure in keeping him there. The bank came calling, demanding payment on loans I'd taken to expand the farm during the good years. My own brother, who I'd helped through his lean times, turned his back on me when I asked for a loan to tide us over. Friends I'd known since childhood crossed the street rather than face the shame of my circumstances. Thomas Hartwell, a man in his 40s who'd lost his general store to creditors just last month, nodded grimly. He understood the bitter taste of betrayal, how quickly respect could turn to pity, and pity to avoidance. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in November, Ezra said, his voice growing quieter, drawing his listeners closer. "Sarah took sick with fever, and without money for a doctor or proper medicine, I could only watch helplessly as the life drained from her beautiful face. She died holding my hand, whispering that she wasn't afraid, that the Lord would provide for us somehow." The preacher stopped walking and faced his congregation directly. 2 days later, my youngest boy, little Samuel, followed his mother to the grave. Same fever, same helplessness on my part. My older son, Jacob, looked at me with eyes full of accusation and pain, and I couldn't blame him. In his mind, and truth be told in mine too, I had failed as a husband and father. Margaret O'Brien dabbed at her eyes with a faded handkerchief. She'd buried 2 children herself and knew the crushing weight of a parent's grief. Her husband Patrick worked 18 hours a day in the mines, and still they could barely afford flour and beans. I sold what was left of the farm for a fraction of what it was worth, just enough to pay the most pressing debts and buy a wagon. Jacob and I loaded up our few remaining possessions and headed west. 2 broken men running from memories too painful to bear. But here's what I learned, friends. You can't outrun poverty of the spirit. It follows you like a shadow, whispering lies about your worth, about God's love, about whether tomorrow will bring anything but more sorrow. Ezra reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small tattered piece of paper. Jacob and I made camp one night beside a creek in Colorado territory. We'd been traveling for weeks, and our supplies were nearly gone. I was at the end of my rope, ready to give up entirely. That's when I found this, a piece of newspaper that had blown into our campsite, with just a few verses from Psalm 30. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. He looked up from the paper, his eyes bright with conviction. Something stirred in my heart when I read those words. Here I was, fretting about everything, our lack of money, our uncertain future, the seeming unfairness of life. But this psalm was telling me to stop fretting and start trusting. The wind had died down, and the small church felt wrapped in expectant silence. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing the importance of the moment. I started reading that psalm every morning when I woke up, and every evening before sleep. At first the words felt empty, like I was just going through motions, but gradually something began to change inside me. The psalm says, "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass." Sarah Jenkins leaned forward, her heart hungry for any word of hope. She'd been delighting in nothing but worry and fear since her husband's death, and the idea of finding delight in the Lord seemed as foreign as a language she'd never heard. "Now I want to be clear about something," Ezra said, his tone becoming more intense. "This psalm isn't some magic formula that guarantees earthly riches. I've met plenty of godly folks who were poor in material goods, but rich in spirit, and I've known wealthy men whose souls were as barren as a desert. The curse of poverty that this psalm addresses isn't just about money, it's about a poverty of hope, of purpose, of connection to the Almighty." He began pacing again, his voice growing stronger. "You see, when we're caught in the grip of desperation, we start making decisions based on fear instead of faith. We become envious of those who seem to prosper through dishonest means. We begin to doubt God's goodness, his provision, his very existence. That's the real curse, the spiritual poverty that makes us unable to see the blessings that surround us, even in our darkest hours." Thomas Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. He'd been harboring bitter thoughts about the banker who'd foreclosed on his store, a man who seemed to grow richer while honest folks struggled. The preacher's words struck uncomfortably close to home. As Jacob and I continued our journey west, I made it a practice to speak this psalm aloud every single day. Not just read it silently, but speak it with conviction, like I was claiming the promises for myself and my boy. "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delighteth in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholdeth him with his hand." Ezra's voice took on a rhythmic quality, almost musical in its cadence. "I'd been cast down, friends, cast down as low as a man can go. But that verse promised I wouldn't be utterly destroyed, that the Lord's hand would uphold me. Day by day, as I spoke these words, I began to feel that upholding hand." The preacher paused at the small window, gazing out at the endless expanse of prairie grass, bending in the evening breeze. We reached Denver with nothing but hope, and these daily words from Psalm 30. I had no trade except farming, no connections, no money to start over. But that psalm had taught me to wait on the Lord, to trust in his timing rather than my own desperate scheme. Margaret O'Brien found herself mouthing the words along with him as he quoted, "Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way, because of the man who bringeth wicked devices to pass." I found work as a day laborer, loading wagons and hauling supplies for merchants. It was hard work for little pay, but every morning I spoke that psalm, and every evening I thanked God for his provision. Jacob, bless his heart, found work too, sweeping floors and running errands. We lived in a boarding house that wasn't much better than a stable, but we had a roof and regular meals. The small congregation was completely absorbed in his story now, seeing their own struggles reflected in his work. These were people who understood hard work for little pay, who knew what it meant to be grateful for simple shelter and basic food. One day, about 6 months after we'd arrived in Denver, I was loading a wagon with supplies for a surveying party when the expedition leader struck up a conversation with me. He'd been watching me work and was impressed by my diligence and honesty. Turns out he needed someone to help manage supplies and coordinate with local settlers as they mapped out new territories. The pay was better, and more importantly, it was work that used my mind as well as my back. Ezra turned back to face his listener. Now some might call that luck or coincidence, but I knew better. That psalm had taught me that the Lord knoweth the days of the upright, and their inheritance shall be forever. They shall not be ashamed in the evil time, and in the days of famine they shall be satisfied. Sarah Jenkins felt a stirring of something she'd almost forgotten, hope. She'd been so focused on her immediate struggles that she'd lost sight of any future beyond the next meal, the next day's survival. The surveying work led to other opportunities. I gained a reputation as an honest man who could read and write, who treated everyone with respect regardless of their station in life. People began to trust me with their business, asking me to help with contracts and legal documents. I wasn't getting rich, mind you, but we were no longer desperate. Thomas Hartwell leaned forward, intrigued despite his cynicism. He'd always been good with numbers and organization. Maybe there were opportunities he hadn't considered in his despair. But the real change, the one that mattered most, was happening in my heart, Ezra continued. That daily practice of speaking the psalm was reshaping how I saw the world. Instead of looking at others with envy or resentment, I began to see potential friends and opportunities for service. Instead of hoarding what little I had from fear, I started giving generously to those in greater need. He pulled out his worn Bible and opened it to Psalm 30. Listen to these words. I have been young, and now am old. Yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. He is ever merciful and lendeth, and his seed is blessed. Margaret O'Brien thought of her own children, how she worried constantly about their future. The idea that righteous living could secure blessings for the next generation was almost too wonderful to believe. Jacob and I started a small business helping new settlers get established in the territory. We'd help them find good land, negotiate fair prices, connect them with suppliers and laborers. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest and needed. More importantly, it allowed us to be instruments of blessing in other people's lives. The preacher's eyes grew misty with memory. 5 years after we'd arrived in Denver with nothing, Jacob married a wonderful young woman named Ruth, and they made me a grandfather. We'd built a modest home, had money in the bank, and more importantly, we'd found our purpose. The curse of poverty had been broken, not because we'd become wealthy, but because we'd learned to trust in the Lord's provision, and to find our delight in serving Him and others. The congregation sat in rapt attention, many of them wiping away tears. These were stories they needed to hear, examples of real people overcoming real hardships through faith and perseverance. Now I want to share with you the specific way I've been speaking this psalm for the past 20 years. Ezra said, his voice taking on an instructional tone, because there's power in speaking God's word aloud, in claiming His promises with our voices, not just our minds. He held up his Bible and began to read, but not in the formal, distant tone of many preachers. Instead, he spoke as if he were having a conversation with a trusted friend, personalizing each verse. I will not fret because of evildoers, neither will I be envious against workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like grass and wither as the green herb. He paused. I speak this when I'm tempted to compare my situation to those who seem to prosper through dishonest means. It reminds me that true prosperity comes from righteousness, not from schemes and short. Sarah Jenkins nodded, thinking of the wealthy landowner who'd cheated her husband out of wages just before his death. She'd harbored such bitterness toward that man, but maybe it was time to let go of that poison. I trust in the Lord and do good, so I shall dwell in the land and verily be fed. Ezra's voice grew stronger. This isn't passive waiting, it's active trust, combined with purposeful action. I trust God, but I also do the work He puts before me. I believe He'll provide, but I also plant seeds and tend crops and show up for labor. Thomas Hartwell felt something shift in his thinking. He'd been so focused on his losses that he'd stopped looking for new opportunities to do good work. I delight myself in the Lord, and He gives me the desires of my heart. The preacher's face lit up with joy. This was the hardest verse for me to understand at first. How could I delight in the Lord when everything seemed to be going wrong? But I learned that delighting in God means finding joy in His character, His faithfulness, His love, regardless of my circumstance. Margaret O'Brien had never thought about finding delight in the midst of hardship. It seemed almost revolutionary, this idea that joy could coexist with struggle. I commit my way to the Lord and trust in Him, and He brings it to pass. He brings forth my righteousness as the light and my judgment as the noonday. Ezra closed his eyes briefly. This is about surrendering control, admitting that my ways have led to failure, and trusting that God's ways are higher and better. It's about believing that He sees the full picture when I can only see my immediate circumstances. The small church had grown completely silent except for the sound of the preacher's voice and the gentle whisper of wind through the prairie grass outside. I rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. I do not fret because of those who prosper in their way, those who bring wicked devices to pass. His tone became more urgent. This is where the rubber meets the road, friend. Resting and waiting doesn't mean being passive, it means working diligently while trusting in God's timing rather than demanding immediate results. He walked to the center of the small space, looking each person in the eye as he continued, I cease from anger and forsake wrath, I do not fret. It only causes harm. The preacher's voice softened. Anger and worry are thieves that steal our peace and cloud our judgment. They make us unable to see the opportunities and blessings that God places in our path. Sarah Jenkins felt the truth of those words in her bones. Her anger and worry had been constant companions since her husband's death, and they'd brought her nothing but sleepless nights and bitter tears. The wicked draw the sword and bend their bow to cast down the poor and needy, but their sword shall enter their own heart, and their bows shall be broken. Ezra's voice carried righteous conviction. Those who prey on the vulnerable will ultimately face justice. We don't need to seek revenge. God will handle that in his own time and way. Thomas Hartwell thought again of the banker who'd foreclosed on his store, and for the first time in months, he felt the burden of resentment beginning to lift from his shoulders. A little that a righteous man has is better than the riches of many wicked, for the arms of the wicked shall be broken, but the Lord upholds the righteous. The preacher spread his arms wide. This isn't about despising wealth or romanticizing poverty, it's about understanding that contentment and security come from our relationship with God, not from our bank account. He continued through the psalm, personalizing each verse, showing how it applied to daily struggles and fear. Margaret O'Brien found herself imagining what it would feel like to truly believe that her steps were ordered by the Lord, that even though she might stumble, she wouldn't be utterly cast down. I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor their children begging bread. The righteous are ever merciful and lend, and their children are blessed. Ezra's voice cracked with emotion. Friends, I've lived this verse. I've been the young man who thought he had everything figured out, and I've been the older man who's learned to trust in God's faithfulness. I've seen him provide in ways I never could have imagined. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the small windows of the sod church. The preacher's voice took on a more intimate quality as he neared the end of the psalm. Mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace. But the transgressors shall be destroyed together, the end of the wicked shall be cut off. But the salvation of the righteous is of the Lord, he is their strength in time of trouble. And the Lord shall help them and deliver them from the wicked, and save them because they trust in him. Ezra closed his Bible gently and looked out over the small congregation. For 20 years I've spoken these words every single morning when I wake up and every evening before I sleep. I've watched them transform my heart, my circumstances, and my understanding of what it means to be truly prosperous. Sarah Jenkins wiped tears from her eyes. Something had stirred to life in her heart during the preacher's words, a tiny flame of hope that she thought had been extinguished forever. The curse of poverty isn't broken by magic words or wishful thinking. Ezra continued, it's broken by aligning our hearts and minds with God's truth, by choosing to trust his provision rather than relying on our own understanding, by finding our delight in him rather than in temporary things that can be taken away. Thomas Hartwell felt a strange sensation in his chest. Was this what hope felt like? He'd been so angry for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to look forward to tomorrow. I want each of you to take this psalm with you, the preacher said, reaching into a worn satchel and pulling out hand-copied pages. I've written it out for anyone who wants it. Speak it every day. Not just read it, but speak it aloud with faith and conviction. Let these words reshape your thinking about your circumstances, about God's character, about your future. Margaret O'Brien stood up slowly, her joints aching from the hard bench, but her spirit lighter than it had been in months. She reached for one of the copied psalms with trembling hands. Remember, friends, Ezra said as people began to stir and collect the precious papers, this isn't about getting rich quick, or having all your problems disappear overnight. This is about breaking free from the spiritual poverty that keeps us trapped in cycles of fear, envy and despair. This is about learning to see with eyes of faith, instead of eyes of fear. One by one the small congregation filed past the preacher, many of them pausing to shake his hand or whisper a word of thanks. Sarah Jenkins lingered, holding her copy of the psalm against her chest like a treasure. Preacher, she said softly, I lost my husband 6 months ago, and I've been so angry at God, so afraid for my children's future. Do you really believe this psalm can help someone like me? Ezra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sister, I've seen it work in my own life and in the lives of countless others. Not because the words are magic, but because they point us toward truth. the truth that God sees your struggles, that He hasn't forgotten you, that He has plans for your future that you can't see yet. As the small church emptied and people began their long walks home across the prairie, Ezra remained behind, kneeling at the rough wooden altar. He pulled out his own worn copy of Psalm 37 and began to speak the familiar words aloud, just as he had every day for 20 years. The wind picked up again outside, but inside the small sod church, there was peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for all of them. Sarah Jenkins would still need to find work to feed her children. Thomas Hartwell would still need to figure out how to rebuild his life. Margaret O'Brien would still worry about her family's future. But tonight, they each carried home a piece of paper with words that had the power to transform hearts and break the curse of spiritual poverty. In the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen in that small frontier community. Sarah Jenkins found work as a seamstress for the town's leading families, and her reputation for honest, quality work spread quickly. Thomas Hartwell partnered with a traveling merchant to establish a new trading post, using his skills with numbers and organization to build something even better than what he'd lost. Margaret O'Brien's husband was promoted to shift supervisor at the mine, and they were able to move their family into a larger home. Were these changes simply coincidence? Had their circumstances improved merely because they'd started thinking more positive? Or was there something deeper at work, a spiritual principle that aligned their hearts with divine provision? Each morning, in 3 different homes across the windswept prairie, voices could be heard speaking the same ancient words. I will not fret because of evildoers. I trust in the Lord and do good. I delight myself in the Lord. I commit my way to the Lord and trust in Him. And each evening, as the sun set over the endless grassland, those same voices would speak the psalm again, claiming promises that had sustained believers for thousands of years. The Lord knows the days of the upright. I have been young and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken. The salvation of the righteous is of the Lord. The curse of poverty, not just material poverty, but the deeper poverty of spirit that steals hope and breeds despair, was being broken one word, one day, one faithful heart at a time. This psalm daily, and watch as the chains of lack and limitation fall away, replaced by the abundant provision that flows from a heart aligned with divine truth.